What's up, everybody? I am live and direct, well, recorded and direct. My main man, Ramiro Berrelleza from Okteto. Ramiro, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Bart. Thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and talk to the overall data and Kubernetes community. As you know, one of my favorite communities. It's always fantastic to share more of the world of Kubernetes, especially in our case, from the voice of the developer.
Very, very good. We can't value developers enough. And one thing I wanted to, before we get started, just because it came up a little bit when we were talking before we hit the record button, is the whole thing about platform engineering. And this is something we want to, the new paradigm, buzzword, hot topic. When we're thinking about this in a data on Kubernetes, context, what are the things that come to mind that people should be aware of that they might be missing out on as we, embrace platform engineering as really the new paradigm?
Yeah, there's this. I've been reading a lot about this concept. It's something that I first heard Daniel Bryan from Ambassador, good friend, talk about this idea of golden paths, and I think this is something that really resonates with me. Which is, as you think of platform, this idea that hey, you can build something that's good for the 80%. Right? You always have developers and systems that will require some special cases, but as you think about platform, if you can identify these golden paths where like, hey, I can make 80% of engineers successful by just offering them these three things, these three configurations, these three recommendations. For me, that's a very valuable part of platform, and it's a natural evolution from DevOps, which for me is kind of the same thing. I don't buy the whole. I understand why companies need to create some controversy, and it's a good way to kind of kickstart conversations. But at the end of the day, to me, it's a continuum of like DevOps, infra as code, data, Kubernetes, and then platform is just, hey, how do you make it so that all these efforts that your team is building, how do you make that available to everybody so that everybody can benefit rather than just you? And at the beginning, we solved this by saying, hey, I'm going to put infra as code on a repo, and that was great. And that's how you got things like the Kubernetes YAMLs, one-click deploy or kubectl apply, and you have a full application running. GitOps came later. And I think platform is the next level is, okay, how do I make this even more accessible to everybody in a way that it doesn't require a commit or it doesn't require modifying YAMLs? Because I think we overdid YAML a bit in our community. And now developers are like, okay, I love YAML, but I want something a bit more usable. How do I deal with that? And for me, platform is a lot of these things of, which are topics I love and I can go on forever, but experience, making it more inclusive for more people. How do you make these platforms available, not just for those of us who are DevOps minded, but for everybody else in your organization? Because for us, and Okteto builds a platform, so I'm a bit biased here, but at the same time, I talk a lot about this with companies all over the world. The idea of like, how do I make my team more efficient without having to train everybody on DevOps, on Kubernetes, on data, on infrastructure, comes a lot. Because CTOs, they're like, hey, I want to make my team more effective. And they see a lot of this, if you have to train a business logic developer, a bank, somebody who's an expert on Java, and is an expert on high performance transactions, that's super valuable. So any more time you spend teaching them Kubernetes, rather than getting better at, I don't know, how to use Kafka at scale, it's a waste for everybody. So I've been seeing a lot of that, and that's a topic that now I talk a lot with Okteto, is this idea of build a golden path, build a platform, leverage all these resources that Kubernetes gives you, and you'll see in a second, like all the things you can do with data and all these Kubernetes primitives that you can mix together in a way that making it accessible for everybody and not just for the YAML experts.
Very, very good. Sharing is caring, being inclusive, broadening the scope, getting those other stakeholders in there, helping folks make better decisions by all having access to the same information to be able to understand common problems and to be solving things in a collaborative way. Very, very good. Like you said, bit of a buzzword, but we got to talk about it. That being said, you got some slides, you got a demo you want to share, go for it.
All right. It's very light slides. I just like this to kind of set the conversation, so it won't be too boring. So I going with buzzwords and provocative statements. I named this demo, developers need data.
And they do.
And
they most definitely
and
do.
they do. And we've talked about this before. And it's a topic that is very close to my heart. So I talk about this every time I can, because one of the things I've noticed over the years is that the data conversation is very focused on production. And in the early days of the data and Kubernetes community, and Bart, you know this better than probably anybody else in the world, most people were like, no, you cannot run data on Kubernetes. And then it was like, no, of course you can. And now we have companies running data at scale on Kubernetes, everything from like traditional databases to event-driven, document-based, everything. But then as this conversation changed from like, we can run data on Kubernetes to like, yeah, of course we can. How do we do it? How do we scale it? I think a piece that's been changing, but it was forgotten for a while is, what about developers, right? What do they do? And for me, this is an important part of the conversation because data is a fundamental part of any cloud native application. I have a friend, and a lot of people say this, it becomes kind of a cliche, but in reality, like everything we do as developers is just move data from one place to the next. And we do more than that, but at the end of the day, that's what our customers use our applications for, right? Like you're using a database, not because you love tinkering with databases, and I love tinkering with databases, and it's fun to just kind of poke things around and see what they can do. But in reality, they exist because we have valuable data that our customers need, and we need to keep that safe somewhere. And databases are great for that. And then all the code we write to retrieve it, massage it, show it in different ways, act on it. But data is fundamental. So when you're building a cloud native application, as a developer, you cannot ignore data. You cannot ignore other things, but data for me is the most important piece that we often forget about. And running data in Kubernetes, and if you're seeing this and if you're a member of the community, you know this, but for the rest, it's now mainstream. Like every major vendor of databases or any other type of data storage now has a Kubernetes solution, best practice, call it what you may. Even a lot of the big providers, they're running their own data solutions on Kubernetes. And, data is something developers do care about, because even if you don't care directly about it, we did a survey with our customers, and data came on all the way up on like one of the major causes for production issues. And think about it. Data migrations, data not looking like what we expect. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has written some code assuming that a name looks a certain way, or that an address looks a certain way, that it has a street name and a number. Newsflash, in other parts of the world, this is not true. So as we build global applications, all these things come up. So data is something that we need to care about, because we need to ensure that our code can handle all this data. But data is hard to use. In the old days, you can have a script, you can have a database replica somewhere, but it's hard. And most teams that I know went with this, right? Static data set that somebody generated once, maybe from production, maybe fake data. But developers, typically, they don't have access to this rich data, which means that we trust production as the way to test data. We assume staging might have some information that we can use. But this is far from the ideal. And this is a problem that we know exists. The industry knows this. In the past, I would say 5 years or so, I've seen a lot of companies pop up. This is an example of companies that I know. Doesn't mean to be representative, but you have Tonic, Snaplet, SDV, Interim, Privacy Dynamics, doing different things to solve this data. In one side of the spectrum, you have Tonic making fake data, as they call the fake data company, where you'll give them some rules and they'll generate data that looks like production, but it's entirely fake. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Privacy Dynamics, which takes real data, cleans it up, makes it easy for developers to access it without compromising your customers' anonymity and privacy. So it depends where you stand on this. I have strong opinions on this topic, but there's another video for that. I'm not going to touch on this today, but it is a problem that the industry realizes, hey, we need to give developers data and we need to make it easy. So today I'm going to talk about how you can make this available on Kubernetes using building blocks from Kubernetes. So our company, Okteto, we built a solution for remote dev environments on Kubernetes. We have both open source, self-hosted SaaS. But the overall concept is, and this is also an industry trend, is we're moving development to the cloud. So in our case, by moving development to Kubernetes, you can start to leverage all the resources you have on Kubernetes also for development. For me, I'm one of the maintainers of Okteto. Our core mission was reducing the difference between dev, staging, and production by moving your development to Kubernetes. And one of the most interesting use cases that have emerged through our community was, hey, I'm on Kubernetes. I'm running data on Kubernetes. Can I access that data for development on Kubernetes? And it turns out that you can. One of the most interesting uses of remote dev environments on Kubernetes is that now you can take those data sets that you have in production, staging, depending on your policy around data, and make that available or make that same shape of data available for your dev environment, because now everything is on Kubernetes. So you're no longer moving data around, trying to reinvent storage solutions and things like that. And I'll show you a demo in a second. So let me position this. I call this a case study because I'm going to talk about real issues that some of our community members have. I'm going to mention names, but take my word for this. Everything here is based on real industry problems. So we have this company. It's one of the biggest e-commerce stores in South America. As you can imagine, e-commerce stuff are very data heavy. You have users, you have transactions, you have catalogs. Plus, they're doing all these interesting things around AI for recommendation and things like that. Before Kubernetes, developers, they didn't have access to data. They run all their services locally, whatever they could, using other technologies, Docker Compose, some services just like starting them on your computer. They didn't have any data. So one of the architects there built a script to generate data that looked like production. Because they wanted something comprehensive, it was a lot of data, and it took a long time. It took about an hour for them to run this script, which meant that developers rarely ran this. They were just like, no, just once, keep the database forever. It's out of date. I don't care. Nobody likes to spend 1 hour just waiting for a SQL script to run. They did have a single remote environment that was shared across the entire company. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this. This one was running on Kubernetes. So they could share that. But like all shared environments, they're often broken, they're out of date. They're all saying like if it's owned by everybody, it's not owned by anybody, which means that every developer was like, log in, use it, leave it. And then the next developer was like, okay, how do I reset things? Where do I get more data from? So it was annoying, it was inefficient. And more importantly, because the data was always out of date, it was not a useful resource. So as I was saying earlier about golden paths, they wanted to offer a golden path to their developers, a standard way that 80% of developers could just use, benefit from it, and don't have to think about it. So they wanted to be able to give every developer its own copy of the application and of production data. They wanted to be able to handle multiple data schemas so they can do things like test a migration before you hit staging, major changes where you're like validating new data. They wanted to be able to run this on Kubernetes because they knew that Kubernetes is really good at running inf at scale, so it's cheaper. Very important, they wanted to be self-service because they did not want to move to a world where the platform teams has 100 tickets on their queue every day for given environment, shut it down, give me another schema, I need more data, all that stuff. And finally, for them, because they have highly privileged information, names, addresses, credit cards, this data must be secure. This is not where like everybody can access anything and just be with it. If you follow the news, there have been a few data breaches in the last 12 months caused because developers had access to production data when they shouldn't have. So they were very aware of this. They are a regulated industry because of all this data, so they wanted to be secure. So what I'm going to show you in this demo is what we did with them, how we work with these different pieces. And then I get back to kind of give you a quick conclusion, but I wanted to show some code and something. So now switch back to cool Kubernetes. So for this demo, I'm using Okteto. This is what our platform looks like. It's all Kubernetes behind the scenes. So anything you can do here, you can also do directly on YAML. I'll show you the YAMLs. I just like the self-service access of Okteto. So imagine that you work for this company and you have a staging namespace. It's there. It's already running. So it's an application. In this case, we're using our demo because we can show our this company's app, but it's similar, right? I wrote this. We wrote this app. It lets you rent movies, but it has kind of the same components. Right? It has a shopping cart, transaction, all that stuff. Everything is open source. It's on GitHub. We'll share the links at the end of the recording if you want to try this on yourself, or if you want to use this as reference for doing it yourselves. But the main thing here is it's a functional application. So this is one of the first benefits of running your dev environments in Kubernetes is you can offer self-service to everybody. So I could go and I can click on the application. I can rent a movie. You can see all the things that happen here. In this case, I want to show you this. This is the admin panel of this application. And in this case, very simple. We have all this data. Names, last name, phones, where from, zip code, their age, their gender, all very private, all information that nobody else should have. And we have about here 10,000 users. But this is the data that we want to make our developers access to. And traditionally, what would happen is you deploy your application or you don't have any data, or the data is fake. And that's not ideal, right? You can see here that we have different states, different countries, phone numbers that look different. Some of them start with a 0, different names. The gender distribution might be important for some of our ML algorithms, the age distribution, all those things matter, right? So we wanted data that represents realistically what our customers are doing. So that's what we're going to do. So what we did is we are using a few different components of Kubernetes, namely volume snapshots and volume snapshot content to do this. And just to show you real quick, so I realize that I'm jumping here something. This is what we implemented for them. That I'll show you in a second is this workflow where you have a database in production or staging. The first thing you do is you're going to run the same database on Kubernetes. Let's say it's Postgres, Cockroach, Mongo. You can run them, all of them. In their case, they're running a PII removal process because they want to they have their own algorithms how to clean up the data because they don't want to make it available for developers. They don't want other people to know my address. So what they did is they're using one of those companies I show you about to do a very sophisticated PII removal process. So then they have this container-based DB. Then automatically every day at midnight, they generate a snapshot of this, and they're using Kubernetes volume snapshot. This is one of the resources I highly recommend. You need to have one of the CSI plugins for this, but it's fantastic. It allows you to just clone a snapshot anywhere in Kubernetes. You have a volume, you snapshot that. And then they're using Okteto to make this snapshot available to everybody. What this means is that when a developer gets there anytime, and they want to deploy their dev environment, they can take this snapshot. Okteto automatically creates the resources, but you need a volume snapshot content, and a PVC, all as standard Kubernetes resources. You create that data, and then you mount this as a volume on your database. Again, anything, MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB, Cockroach, any of this works. And then the developers have a dev environment with real data, clean data. They don't have to think about it. It's up to date. It has the latest schema. So how does this look like? I'm going to go here to my code, and this is kind of like the magic. This is a standard Kubernetes. You have a volume snapshot. That's the class name. It's still in beta, but it's broadly available. We've run tests on all the major cloud providers and on hand-roll clusters. The only thing you need to do is make sure that your storage plugin supports that. So the CSI, all the default plugins supported now. You create the snapshot. You create a snapshot class before. You point it to a volume claim as your source of data. You create this snapshot, and that's it. And it takes a couple of minutes. So I did this before, but let me download my KubeCon credentials from Okteto. And then let's see if this works. Get volume snapshot. And in this case, it's coming from staging. And you see that it's here, right? I have the snapshot. I like to use the name, the date, just so I know where it was generated. But you can see all the information here. Let's do something here. Put an output YAML. And just to show you real quick how this looks like, right? Very standard Kubernetes object. The main thing is it has data. It came from a persistent volume. Once you create the snapshot, you don't have to keep displaying around. You can delete it. The data is there, which means that you can create one every day and then even spin them off, delete them if you're doing something ephemeral. In this case, I'm using staging, so I just have a cron job that every day runs this process. So it's completely sync. You're not blocking everybody, and you have this volume snapshot available. And then what happens? Well, what this means is that I can go, in this case, again, I'm using Okteto just to make it easier to show you, but it's something that can be used directly with Kubernetes. Launch an environment. I have a pre-configured template called Movies with Real Data that I will show in a second. And you click launch. And what's going to happen now is that Okteto is going to take that snapshot that we created yesterday. It's going to create an instance of Postgres. It's going to mount this there. And when this is all done, up and running, you're going to have the same data that on staging. So I did this cookie show style. I have something ready, so we don't have to wait for that to run. But I have my own dev environment. You can see it's a different URL. It's not a staging. This is just for myself. I have it here. And if I go to the admin section, you'll see that I have data and that this data looks exactly like a staging. In this case, I didn't clean anything. I could have run my own PII removal, but I have my data. And this is a very simple demo, but I wanted to show you the power of giving developers access to data. This means that now I can run tests, I can validate, and this came from one of our customers. Super interesting. They were building this ML algorithm, and they realized that their fake data was creating a bias on their recommendation algorithm because their fake data didn't have a good representation of gender and age compared to production. So by being able to give developers secure access to data in production, what they did in that case is they kept gender and age, but then they kind of like remove all the rest of the data. That meant their algorithms were better because they look more like production and they look more like their users rather than what they think their users look like. So it's a very interesting, nuanced change, but this produces better software and makes it easier for developers because if you look here, I don't have to figure out where do I get the data from, where do I get my seeded data. Like this was a snapshot that an admin created for me, automation, and I showed this to Okteto, but this is just doing kubectl apply and Helm install. It's all automated to give me that golden path where I can just click and see it. And just to wrap it up, let me show you, like if we go here to get PVC, and in this case, I'm going to use this namespace with real data. You'll see that there's a data storage class here. PVC. Let me hide this. It's getting in the way. If I get this one and I do this, you'll see that it's a regular PVC, but you'll see that there's a section that says it's using a storage provisioner. In this case, the CSI that's talking about, this is the one that's compatible to use snapshot content. And you'll see that there is a data source volume snapshot. And this is what is allowing me to mount it. So this is something that is native to Kubernetes. It's super useful. The documentation is there. If you want to automate that, you can use something like Okteto, but there are other tools out there. If you want to build yourselves, look up for volume snapshots and volume snapshot content. These are like fantastically useful resources, native to Kubernetes and native to the increasingly rich data management tools that Kubernetes offers to build this for every developer in your team. And quick conclusion of like, Kubernetes has very rich data management controllers and resources. You can make them for developers, not just for production, CSI drivers, volume snapshots, snapshot contents, PVCs. All of this integrates really well with Kubernetes, with your favorite cloud provider, with all your databases, any other storage device. You could be using something like Minio to make artifacts available, anything you want. It's very powerful. It's in the early days, so you need to like build some things yourself to glue things together. That's why we did this on our project. But you can also do it yourself. You can find other vendors. It's a very interesting aspect of Kubernetes that it's early, but it creates very powerful data-driven dev experiences, which I think is something that we need to focus more on. I show you how it works. You create this pipeline. It's completely async, so your developers are not blocked or waiting for data to be created. You can make this very fast. Like this use case I mentioned about, we help them fine-tune their infrastructure, their data drivers, and whatnot. And it takes seconds to spin up a new database with almost a terabyte of data. So it's very exciting. It makes for a fantastic dev experience. In their case, what happens, like 6 months later? Well, now every developer can launch an entire copy of their application on Kubernetes with realistic data. They now can deploy even multiple versions with different data, a full data set, or maybe just the best case scenarios, or the data set from a year ago because they want to evaluate some schemas or try to make sure the new schema is compatible in the case that they need to do some backup and restore. They do all those things, which makes for better software. Provisioning databases, it's almost instantaneous. And for me, my favorite thing about this is all these environments are ephemeral. You go to their platform, you click deploy, it provisions, you do your work, you delete the environment, and you're done. You don't have to run things in your local machine. You don't have to figure out where to download the data from, how to spin up, a copy of Postgres on your Mac or Windows machine or Linux or whatnot. It's all ephemeral. It's all standard. It all runs in Kubernetes. And it's a platform anybody can benefit from. So the work that is a small group of people, or around 5 people, it's now impacting what 400 developers can do. And that, going back to our early conversation, is one of my favorite things about this new platform mentality is you're building these tools to augment a lot more, like 10, 20x the amount of people involved with the project. And that for me is amazing. As a maker of developer tools, that's a dream come true. And Kubernetes makes it easy. And as you saw today, it makes it super easy to access data. So if you have any questions, I'm online. This will be posted on the community. I'll be there. I'm on the DoK Slack. If you want to chat, I'm also on Twitter, Berrelleza, and I'm also on Mastodon in the Fediverse, Ramiro at hatchiderm.io. Always happy to talk about dev experience, Kubernetes, data, share what we've learned. And if you want to try Okteto, okteto.com, free to try, free for small customers. There's also an open source version on GitHub/Okteto/Okteto. And I hope this was useful. I hope this helped you open up your mind a bit on the possibilities of Kubernetes and on how important it is to think about data. Because remember, developers need data to be efficient, not just infrastructure.
It's fantastic. And I think you nailed it. And this is a point that you've been educating us on since you got involved in the community. And it's so nice to have that perspective because we have lots of folks that have tons of expertise in database and storage, but we can't limit our vision and scope to those 2 areas. And we see other workloads now becoming part of the ecosystem, as we saw in our research report with AI, ML, streaming, messaging. At the end of the day, though, who is not going to interact with developers? Nobody. They've got to be included in the equation, and understanding the difficulties they're going to have, whether it's on the technical side or even, as you mentioned, on the ethical side of where the data is coming from. So I think it's a very, very solid points for us to keep in mind and understand that, as we mentioned at the beginning as well, a lot of this is about democratizing and being more inclusive. So Ramiro, thank you very much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to hearing about the next steps of what's going on in Okteto, what's going on in the world of developer experience, something that is not appreciated enough. So make it a part of your living vocabulary. and we will all see you very soon. All right, take care, everybody.
Thanks, Mark. Always great being here.